everybody, this is Asbjorn back for a third album podcast. Now, of course, with the release of the new album, Blessed Bran, Son of the Sea, there is, of course, another new album podcast. So, thank you for tuning in, and we'll get straight to it. So, the writing process for Blessed Bran was more along the lines of what was done again in Fall of the Northern Kingdom. A lot more melodic riffing, a lot of those similar themes coming up again. Yeah, I really wanted to explore again more Arthurian legend. I wanted to look more into that sort of idea, perhaps a little bit of history chucked in there too, really sort of flesh out the ideas that I set out in Fall of the Northern Kingdom and give them a proper delivery. Because I feel like Fall of the Northern Kingdom, although it had a real underpinning in Arthurian legend, Blessed Bran now really explores all of those Arthurian and old Welsh tales, especially tales from the Mabinogion and from the Black Book of Carmarthen. I really tapped into lots of those similar creative ideas from Fall of the Northern Kingdom. I think a lot of the melodic bands that I was listening to back then have really sort of stayed the same for me. My main staples, my main continual listens, things like Ninkasag. I really enjoy the riffs of Watain, which is something I've tried to channel in this music. Of course, things like Dissection, that always ends up permeating what the Black Pyre music is. But as well in this, I think I've tried to incorporate some more of the blackened punk feel to this album. I've been listening to a lot of the band Rejoice at the moment. Rejoice are a blackened punk, blackened hardcore sort of band from America, and their music really inspired me. And that combined with a love of Darkthrone, I absolutely adore Darkthrone, and I could talk all day about Darkthrone, but I won't. This is a Black Pyre podcast. So the Darkthrone inspired pieces and with Rejoice together really gave the feel for especially Castle Dunatar and, you know, a bit of the outro of Blessed Bran as well. I feel that I wanted to use that blackened punk feel and kind of draw it out a bit, perhaps in a way that uses the blackened punk to build an atmosphere by using the repetitions of those ideas of riffs, chucking in things like D-beat, and really giving that feel of the punkier side of black metal, especially what Darkthrone does. As well, I've been listening to more progressive things too. I've been listening to more Enslaved, I've been listening to more Opeth, and these ideas have somewhat permeated a little of my songwriting, especially in that I'm putting a lot more middle eights into songs, or sort of quieter interludes with clean guitars and maybe melodic solos, and a touch of that almost proggy jazziness that Opeth brings without coming into a jazz band, you know. I'm not trying to make Imperial Triumphant here, not making black and jazz, but just a tiny sprinkle of what that kind of jazzy prog can really bring in for you, and how it can help you colour the notes and get the melodies in a less straightforward way and just play a little more organically. Then you've got songs like Arglwyddes y Llyn that really took a lot of inspiration from the recent Immortal album. Listening to the new Immortal album, it made me feel like I wanted to go back and listen to more of the older Immortal records, and that really inspired me to continue writing in that style, in the old school feel that Black Pyre really started as, kind of return to the roots of what we were initially doing and make more songs akin to that again. So back to the theme then of the album. So it follows the journey of Taliesin the Bard, Taliesin Fawr as he's known in Welsh, and Taliesin is born, and that is really the story of Until I Perish. And the words "until I perish in old age," they are words directly quoted from Taliesin the Bard, and that's why I decided to include them there. Now, Taliesin's story is a fascinating and albeit very strange story, in that in typical Welsh mythological fashion it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but the story is very visual. You can see and hear and feel what's happening within that story, even though it's strange and convoluted and you can't really understand why different things happen the way they do. Then what happens after Taliesin is born is then he is at the side of the great Raven, the great King Bran, the giant king of Britain. Bran weds his daughter to the giant king of Ireland. Now, through various different comings and goings, they end up at war with each other. And one of the things that happens that I was fascinated by is if Nushin, the kin, he's the brother of Bran, decides to become extremely sadistic. He's a brutal warrior. But in the end, if Nushin ends up martyring himself, he sacrifices himself to destroy the magic cauldron of the King of Ireland. And this magic cauldron had been bringing back the Irish soldiers so that Bran and his men were unable to kill them. But unfortunately, in the end, in the battle, Bran had died. And so Taliesin and Manawydan had to sail to Harlech with Bran's head. Now, they spend many years sort of pondering and speaking with the head, and then eventually they finally decide that the head now must be buried, and they bury that in Whitehill in London. Then we get to Taliesin sort of observing Arthur, King Arthur and the legends of King Arthur. Now, Arthur, of course, is supposed to have happened thousands of years after King Bran, so this Taliesin the Bard, Taliesin Vower, he is perhaps an immortal character, but perhaps he's more of a narrator through the ages. He is watching all of these events and he's present at all of the major mythological events. So back to the Arthurian legend part, the next track, Guinevere's Solace. This track is an atmospheric track. It's something that I was playing on piano, and it was more of I was sort of playing around with the piano, getting some ideas down, and it was an idea that just sort of came to me, a very atmospheric piece, something that had a bit of melody that you can follow quite easily, and it made me think of Guinevere sat perhaps by the window, looking out forlornly, waiting for Arthur or Lancelot to return, and that sort of longing, the despair she was feeling. I really thought to channel that into the music, and her loneliness especially. It then follows on quite nicely to Castle Dunatar. Now, Castle Dunatar is a tale about Fergus. Fergus he's just a young boy eager to prove himself, and when Arthur comes hunting for the great white stag close to where he lives, he decides that he wants to prove himself in an interesting way to Arthur. So he sets off on a quest, and in this sort of quest for Arthur, he decides to vanquish the Black Knight. But in doing so, the love that he has for a woman that he's met as a result of speaking with Arthur, her name's Gallienne, and she has already left when he returns, so he's perhaps a little dejected. So he sets out on further quests to get a shield. He returns to Lothian. There's a whole siege in Roxburgh, but eventually what happens is Fergus ends up slaying this magnificent dragon and assisting in the siege in Roxburgh. But essentially, after all of this has happened, Fergus eventually gets together with Gallienne after winning a tournament of Arthur's. Now, the story is quite a standard, maybe romance kind of story that's told through Arthurian legends, but it's not one of the typical stories, which is what drew me to it, and especially the parts about Castle Dunatar. Now, Castle Dunatar is a fascinating castle in Scotland, and I was really drawn to it, not just from the look of the place, but this historic record that it's got. It's been the seat of a dragon, supposedly. It was used to hide the crown jewels of Scotland. It was a sacred shrine to St. Ninian. There was a king that supposedly died there, there was Viking invasions, so this whole place is steeped in rich history, in rich mythology, so that's really what drew me to write a song about it. But of course, the tale of Fergus had more of a narrative that was easier to follow, so that's kind of where the start of the song goes, and then briefly just at the end just touches a little on the history of the place. So by the end of the album then, when we get to the 9 sorceresses of Anon, they're the sorceresses that live on Avalon and communicate with Anon. He's the god of the other world, of the netherworld, of the afterlife. Now, this is kind of symbolic of what's to come next, because of course we know in Agloeddes y Llyn that Sir Bedwyr is communicating with the Lady of the Lake, Agloeddes y Llyn, as she's known in Welsh, and he's telling her that Arthur has died. So, of course, in the 9 sorceresses of Anon, it's symbolic to talk about the death and to explore that and the death and how that relates to Anon, the god of the other world. And then that kind of follows on quite nicely in the voyage to Avalon. Now this is the final voyage that Taliesin is taking to take the body of the great King Arthur to his final resting place in Avalon. Now, Avalon itself is an interesting concept, an island of mists. Now what I decided to do is to combine that with another interesting legend. So there's the legend of the island Hy Brasail, or Hy Brasil as sometimes it's known, and this island is off of the coast of Ireland and is supposed to be another sort of island shrouded in mists that is nearly impossible to find. Interesting trivia about the place, it was actually featured on maps, on quite a few maps, although nobody has actually ever claimed to have properly been there or seen it. There's just sort of tales, likely kind of sailors' stories, perhaps a little embellishment, that kind of thing. So what I decided to do then was to combine the two ideas. So the idea of Avalon being this mystical island where Arthur is buried, and Hy Brasail, and perhaps that's why we've never found the body of King Arthur, because it is a mystical island that he's buried on. It's an island that doesn't actually exist all the time, it's surrounded in mists, it's nearly impossible to find. So that was the kind of idea there behind the inspiration of having Hy Brasail as the final track. It's the final place, it is where Avalon is located in my mind. So finally then, let's go on to the production of the album. So, the actual general instruments, the recording process, quite similar to the previous album. So again with the Soldano 100, again with the same drum kit, same cymbals, but I decided to go for a slightly fresher approach in the mastering and made some slight edits to that to give this album perhaps a slightly richer, slightly fuller sound that you weren't getting through on Fall of the Northern Kingdom. Really just a way of improving the mix that I'd already come up with for Fall of the Northern Kingdom and just bringing it just a touch above, just making it a little more polished, a little better than the last one. So anyway, that's the entire lot then. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for purchasing the album if you've done that. If you've been streaming, also fantastic. Thank you very much. And we will see you again for the next album podcast. Cheers.